Hold on. Hold tight. So setting up our meeting for Facebook. That was me? No, you guys.
I'm shutting everything down.
Are you also streaming this to YouTube or Twitch or?
No, just Facebook right now. What's happening, Spandon? Why is my Facebook open?
I don't know.
Hold on. Now we're having difficulties.
No, I think we're live.
We're live, but I can't see you guys.
No.
So hold on one second, guys. We are getting this together. All right. So we are live on Facebook now. I want to apologize. Hi, everyone. I'm Christine von Reisfeld, founder of People with Empathy. We are here for our second in our panel series discussions. And today we're going to be talking about health data with some amazing people. We have got Amory Grammer down, well, I don't know where she is on your screens. We've got Amory from Ample Biosolutions. We have got Renee Dehan-Kenny from, sorry, Spannon's playing with my computer as I am doing this, so it's kind of throwing me off. But we've got Renee here from Quartz Bio, a part of Precision for Medicine. We have got Michael Middleman. He has an MBA. He's in cybersecurity. And we have got Eric Paraxlis. Sorry, I am always bad at names. But we are here to kind of spur this conversation and talk about data just from different perspectives. So we have two people on here that are really experts in data. I am not an expert. Amory and Renee, we're not experts, but we do have a different perspective that we'd like to talk about. And so we kind of want to go into a basic. I want to tell you really quick, my experience, I've lost data. And so as a patient in this space, that's my concern. And I'd like to kind of address and start off with what is data? Maybe Eric and Mike kind of give your viewpoint and kind of a run through, and then we just go from there. Are we good with that? Everyone? Eric, you want to start?
Sure. Hey, I'm Eric. I'm currently a Rubenstein Fellow at Duke. You know, I've been dealing with data and medical data, particularly since the mid-'80s when I started work at a hospital after 1 year of college. And I think that data has become more complex. I think, first of all, when people think about healthcare data, they're often thinking traditionally, they think about electronic medical record data. They think about their x-rays and their blood work and all that stuff. That's really important. Fast forward to today, and now you think now social determinants are becoming very, very important. I think one of the most interesting and compelling conversations I've heard lately was people that have published recently had said that how you get to work every day, whether you walk, take public transportation, or drive a long distance, may be a better predictor of health outcomes than your genome, which I think is a great kind of statement to put out there, right? Just to see how that works. I'm also very interested in cybersecurity, but I think that healthcare data to a person, to a patient, to a caregiver is just something that's really important, deeply personal, and is an essential tool for their own well-being that needs to be protected.
Mike, your thoughts on data really quick?
My thoughts on data are that data is way more expansive than we originally think it is. I particularly dislike the word, actually, social determinants of health, or the maybe grouping of words, social determinants of health. But when it comes to health data, it's everywhere. And you know, I'm a chronic patient as well as someone who works in cybersecurity. And I do chair a national foundation that works with patients across all 50 states and the US territories, right? And it's really important that we safeguard their data, because we don't just see like their medical record, right? Oftentimes we don't in fact actually see their medical record. It's all kinds of other data, right? And that is something that I and the organization take very seriously. So at the American Living Organ Donor Fund, we mainly work with healthy people, right? Who don't really have any type of chronic illness at all. So a lot of people become less concerned about what is their data. But as someone like myself who has a rare disease, a bunch of kidney transplants, has spent time in many different hospital settings from a child to an adult, I think my health data is almost everywhere, right? Including the things that we share on social media. You know, that the challenge then becomes, what becomes health data and what's not, especially if we're sharing things publicly. So we have to be really careful about that. I think it's much more expansive than people originally think it is.
And then from the other side of it, Amory and Renee not being experts on data, what is your perspective on data really quick? Because, you know, from their perspective, it's something completely different from you in your side of it. What is your, you know, beliefs and perspective on what data is and patient data? Amory, you want to go first?
So I'm Amory Grammer, co-founder of Ample Biosolutions, which is a precision medicine company. So the kind of data that we're focused on is the genes in any cell in your body that are up or down at any time that are really influencing what's going on in every day aspect of your health. So when we talk about data, we're talking about gene expression data. Not the genes that you're born with, but the genes. You could think of a light board at a rock concert, got 20,000 things that could be off and on that change the colors on stage. That's the data that Ample is focused on.
And then Renee, from your perspective, just to even this out and see where we all are in this data space before we go on with conversation, what's your take?
Yeah, so I would say that I share a lot of similarities and perspective with Amory in that I'm a researcher and I work for Quartz Bio, which is part of Precision for Medicine. And, you know, for my entire industry career, we've been really focused on biomarker data. And so analyzing different analytes and metabolites and proteins, genes, that individuals have to make them different and how that impacts kind of their health trajectory. So a lot of times, you know, the data that I'm concerned with is quite far away from the patient. It's only a tiny fraction of it is something that you would see in your EHR. So kind of the privacy of that data is another, you know, element that, you know, has to be considered. But from my time at Patients Like Me, you know, we spent a lot of time thinking about patient-reported health data as well, and how do you couple kind of these empirical molecular measurements together with the patient experience and the information that can be captured from the patient experience as well. So that nexus, I think, is really important. And some of those things are readily shared on social media. Some of them are not, right?
I really like, we all talk about all of this, the data, and you're talking about the precision medicine aspect of it, and we're talking about data safety and privacy and security. I don't know if this really ties in, but I'm wondering about, what do you think about companies? Like, we have people talk about data all the time, wondering what it is, but you also have people, you know, trying to sell their data or whatever, trying to get information on data. Do you find, what's the question I'm trying to say? I want to phrase it the right way, but I want to say, like, people who are, what is the security of your data? You know, I mean, from Eric's perspective, from all of yours, everybody is talking about data security and safety and what's out there. What is safe to put out there? And what, you know, how do these things evolve? And companies where people are paying to get data, are those things that they should be doing?
Maybe, yeah, maybe I can help. One thing that I think is important in this part of the conversation is to frame what privacy, what data privacy and data security are, because they're not necessarily the same things, right? So your data, when you think about data security, that means they're taking the technical and procedural controls to prevent unauthorized use of your data. So use that as an example of something you could call what data security is. Now, just because it's secure, the same group that's keeping your data secure may share it without your knowledge, in which case your data was secure, but it wasn't kept private, right? So privacy and security are often things that get kind of commingled, and they really aren't. So this is especially when we talk about things like social media platforms and stuff like that, that may be sharing data without authorization. That's a great example. Well, maybe they're keeping it secure, but if you're not also respecting the privacy, then it's almost like you're not keeping it secure. So I think that, you know, just as some reference thoughts around that, it's important to put that out there.
And if nobody knows that already, until you've just told everyone, Eric, what's their recourse here? What are we supposed to do? What are people, how do you know that you're securing your data or that you have privacy?
Excuse me. I think that the only thing that you can do is interact with the institutions where you're giving your data. I do think there are really good rubrics and hints and tips and tricks and data available to consumers on how to keep your personal data secure. And it really is the basics in a lot of ways. I think one way when I speak about cybersecurity, one of the things I always say is, bullies and criminals aren't looking for a fight; they're looking for a victim. So if I'm going to stroll down a street, I'm not going to go into the house with the big dogs and the ADT sign. I'm going to go into the house, look with the front door open, and nobody's been home. So the basic things that Norton or Symantec or McAfee would put in their blogs about things you should be doing with your data are good things to do with your data. That said, if you look at data usage policies with institutions, healthcare providers, commercial entities, and stuff like that, it's important to understand that it's very clear and well known that those policies are there to protect those institutions, not you as somebody interacting with those institutions. And so this is really where the caveat emptor part comes in and says you should be choosing who you're working with and why. Understanding that what those things are really meant to do, those things that I accept and I click through about how we're going to use your data, they're meant to protect the institution from liability, not to protect you as a consumer. So I think it's really important and so maybe the corollary to that, where that leads is don't do business with too many places. Keep yourself tight, keep a small circle. There's lots of these basic things that are kind of helpful. Change your information once in a while. All the things that they tell you to do, it's kind of important to do. But with if you have a chronic disease, if you're interacting, you're doing elder care, and you're interacting a lot with a healthcare institution, I would understand what that institution's policies are and whether or not you have any recourse or influence.
Mike, any thoughts on that? Since Mike just actually went through a whole data securities course and is now certified. So from that course, Mike, what'd you learn?
Yeah, so that it's much more than security, right? It's a whole on sort of cybersecurity. But for me, this is fascinating because I like a lot of the things that Eric said. I think it's important for people to make distinctions between security and privacy. I don't think we do enough of that. On the flip side of it, I think I will say that I don't think it's enough these days, right? I don't like to sound like an alarmist, right? But I do think that that organizations are sort of playing fast and loose with patient data. I've said this kind of over and over and again. I think I am giving a talk on Saturday about sort of hacking patient communities, right? If you guys want to attend it, disinfosec.tech, and sort of how easy it is. Yeah. But how easy it really is to kind of get into data is a challenge, right? So I think we have to dig a little bit deeper to some of what Eric is saying, to sort of think, well, what are the security measures that people are taking around our data, right? How seriously do they take those security measures? And then beyond that, what are people doing to our data and with our data, right? So can we track where our data is going? And beyond that, do we know if our data has been breached? And to what extent does that impact us? So I think we really, really need to be careful as people with different types of chronic diseases and conditions. I think we tend to lump data together, right? As we sort of take on these words consumer, I think we begin to lump things more like, hey, it's my credit card, right? It's no big deal. Or, I signed up for this website to buy something and I one time click, right? Amazon makes it really easy to do that. I think we have to be very careful when it comes to our own health data and make a clear distinction between the two. I like to separate out the word consumer quite a bit from what we're talking about here. And it's particularly important to patient communities, right? A lot of us, like Christine, we live in these different communities, and it becomes very important.
So on the other side of it, Amory and Renee, you're kind of on this institution side of it, and if Eric's saying nobody's protecting, everybody's looking out for themselves, what is it that you guys do, or what are you, with data and patient data, what is your thoughts with your companies and what you're doing? Amory, you want to go first? Because I see Renee on mute.
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned, I'm the Chief Scientific Officer of Ample Biosolutions, which is a precision medicine company. So we're not an institution, we're not a medical center. We're commercializing a test that will be point of care for physicians, for decision support, for patients, either in lupus or COVID. So in our situation, all of the data privacy is really on the side of the provider and the payer system. And so
are you not involved in that part of it at all when you're working with health providers? So you're just kind of keeping separate, right?
So we're slated to commercialize Lugene in 2022. So we're in the R&D phase. So when it is commercialized, it will be something a doctor could order, just like a cholesterol test or a CBC. So blood would be drawn in the office or the medical center, go to a central lab. So all of the privacy will be in the hands of the provider and the payer healthcare system.
And then Renee, you've had experience. We work together at Patients Like Me. And I know that everybody, talks about Patients Like Me and the data they've collected. What's your thoughts from that side of it? I mean, I know they're not a provider or a payer, but what is, what's the perspective there in these patient groups as well?
Yeah, sure. It's a really interesting question. And I think from the perspective of the participation in, on the site and on the forum, when I was there, it was all about the terms and the conditions of participation, right? So anything that you wrote on the website, you could not scrape that data. And there were rules against that, of course. And Michael, I'm sure that you'll have an interesting conversation about that kind of stuff on Saturday. But if you were to write something in a forum, then anybody else could read it. And so I think that then becomes all about transparency and communication. And the institution at that time, has to be the broker of that. And the responsibility is on them to be able to very clearly communicate that you might be a for-profit company, or that anything you write in a forum could be seen by anybody else. And yes, we will try to stop people who are going to scrape the website, but that there's really no guarantees. So I think, that is something that it gets to the ability to provide transparency and clarity to the people that are actually putting themselves out there. And it was a little bit of a question that I had when we were talking about this earlier, in terms of when you go through the terms and agreements and click accept, and this can be a really long thing to read. And if you're not used to reading contracts, very difficult. I find it difficult. So I didn't know if there were actually places where patients could go to almost like get the layman's version of a bunch of popular terms and conditions that people might be using in the patient community as well. I don't know if folks knew about that, or we could, write about that later if people did know. But
that is definitely a thing, because I will tell you right now, I don't read anything. It's too many words. I have stand-in.
You need to write a blog then about this.
He's joining me. I'm trying to keep him 6 feet away.
Yeah, so if I could weigh in on that one, right? I think that Renee, it's a good question you brought up, because there are actively some groups working on it. So Christine and I are part, and Eric are part of an organization called the Light Collective. Right. And this is something that very much focuses on patient communities and new types of standards that need to exist, things that are actively being built and driven by patients for patients globally, and with sort of data security and privacy in mind. And it's being pushed forward. So it's a very exciting time. But it's really great points that you brought up about like who's watching, right? is a really important point. And like we're streaming live on Facebook, right? I know some people are probably happy about that. Some people are not, right? So I think that is something to consider, right? But a lot of people are on there.
It's the only platform everybody's on, okay? Make a move somewhere else and I'll be happy to go somewhere else.
Well,
Spannon is gonna say
something. This is an interesting place to bring this in, I think, because one of the reasons we're having this conversation today is people don't realize it, but the loss of health data is fairly common, right? In the last year, 25 million people in the United States have lost their health data to large-scale breaches. Okay, and 93% of healthcare organizations have experienced some form of patient or health data loss over the last 5 years.
So I lost my data and growing up being sick, I have been sick since I was a child. My first surgery was at 5 years old. At that time, my dad didn't even know what I had. It was something that somebody else died of. Nobody knew what it was. I recently found out what it was because of, we found some data. But out of 27 volumes, I have 5,000 pages of my data. I don't know what medications I have been on. I don't know why I stopped medications. I don't know why I stopped treatments. And nobody can tell me because it's gone. So what's my recourse here from you guys in this room thinking, and I know that Amory and Renee, you don't really have a thought on this part, but even just your perspective as a patient or as somebody that's lost their data, what can you do right now?
I mean, I'll start this. One thing that I've seen as a best practice when we were setting up the Undiagnosed Diseases Network Coordinating Center at Harvard back in 2013, one of the things that impressed us the most, and this is a lot of undiagnosed diseases happen in children, about 80%, really rare, unseen things that don't have genotype, phenotype correlations. But the thing that I felt was so powerful in observing what we built in was I had never seen anything as powerful as the binder mom. The caregivers for these, whether it was the mom or the dad, the caregiver for these children observed them all day long and took them to every single appointment. And without knowing what the word meant, had an amazing phenotypic insight, disease manifestation insight into what was going on with their kids because they'd lived with them. They had that kid and on all day long. And so these binders that people have built, and I know, it sounds different in this quote unquote digital age. But I was once asked when I was a CIO of the FDA, what would it take to get FDA to only do drug reviews digitally? And I told the commissioner, let me deinstall all the printers. I said, it's the only way it's going to happen. And in this case, I'm going to give the opposite advice. I'm going to say for people that are going through a serious healthcare journey, go everywhere with your book, with your printouts, and have them. I was diagnosed with renal cancer at only 38 years old. My dad died of cancer when he was 42. So I've actually been managing kidney cancer as a chronic disease for 15 years. I'm in Boston in the Harvard system, and I 100% know that my data doesn't flow between those clinics. And then when I show up with my paperwork, they'll ask for copies of it because they haven't gotten it yet. So in some ways, I know that sounds odd, but have a pen drive that you back up and think about having a book, because I think we're still in that stage in reality.
And I wish I had that advice years ago, because if I had kept some of this data on my own, maybe I wouldn't be in the situation that I was in, So I didn't have the parents that did all that, but I do see these mothers that are absolutely amazing at keeping data. And I see other patients who, keep track of everything, which, I need to get better at. But now that I'm hearing it from you, maybe I will start to now put these things in there. Mike, you're looking like you have something to say.
No, I'm just thinking about this idea of, of losing data, right? Losing your data. And I often think about losing control of your data, right? Also as akin to losing it, right? And I think they kind of go hand in hand. I've certainly lost data before, right? I think about this in one component. So right now I'm involved as an advisor to a group called UNOS, United Network for Organ Sharing, and work with their board of directors and their IT infrastructure. And, one thing that I tend to think about, their work is so important and kind of broad across the United States in terms of organ allocation, sort of decision making, right? Getting all these all over the place, running the organ procurement transplant network. One of the interesting points about it is I was on the organ transplant list as a child, right? And so I started a very long time ago in the health system. So, trying to get, I actually recently tried to get my information from a pediatric institution, right? So I'm almost 40 years old, but I mean, this was kind of fascinating for me because I was at 2 different pediatric institutions. One of them moved from an older location to a new one, and by new, like it was built in the 90s, right? And my information wasn't there, right? So this is sort of a great question, is how far back, I think. Maybe it's archived somewhere, nobody seemed to know. But I think this follows on to a secondary question, or sort of the point that's akin to losing your data, which is the fact that really, we're all participating patients, really, right? And our data is sort of driving, I think, the money train, right? And if you think about this, we're really the ones driving that, right? So if you think about it as like a subway system or an around the world kind of train, right? Plug that in with surveillance economy, and really, I think there maybe we should look into something about compensation, right? I mean, if you lose something and you're a different kind of institution, you compensate people, right? So what happens? I don't know if anybody talks about this at all. I know some of us in different patient communities, like the Light Collective, we talk about this, but what happens if an organization loses your information, right?
So Mike,
it's a great question.
We've had that conversation, and
we have.
Actually, this is why I brought Renee and Amory in too, as well, is that I have that precision medicine aspect of it. And me as a patient who has lost their data, and I'm not sure how many of you know, but I have 3 joint replacements, 2 knee replacements, 1 shoulder. I have toxic encephalopathy from methotrexate, and I've lost some of my night vision to another med. So I have all of these things going on with these drugs, no records, nothing. What I think in this case for me, and what helped me, was being part of Stanford's Human-Wide program, which is the precision medicine initiative. And I got my pharmacogenomics test. What I honestly think is that test changed everything, right? I no longer have to go through step therapy to find out how I process these drugs. And I've been on every single one of them. I don't know why I came off of them. I don't know why I stopped them. I know I had side effects. They stopped for a reason. I don't know why. Pharmacogenomics now tells me how I metabolize these drugs. I honestly think if an institution loses your records, why would this not be an option at some point to say, yes, we apologize, we lost your records, we're extremely sorry. But here, in place of it, we'll offer you your pharmacogenomics, we'll give you this advice or this information that will now help you in the future. But I'm not sure. I don't know how that works. That's just my suggestion. And I kind of wanted to bring the girls in to give their perspective on that and what they thought, and then maybe get you and Eric's opinion on that as well. I don't know. Renee, you want to start since Amory keeps starting?
Sure. So I think it's a totally fascinating idea that I had never considered before. I think that the loss of your medical records and data is something that's obviously super precious and not replaceable. And I think if the institution, if there are tools and resources like a pharmacogenomics test that is, completely solid in terms of reliability, it's been tested, you can, the doctor can have a lot of confidence in the results of that test, then I think it is a fantastic idea to offer something like that, to be able to begin to replace what is lost. My guess is that would just, be part of what was lost. And there was probably a lot of other information that we just don't, unfortunately, right now have. tests for or anything that will kind of characterize you in that way to replace everything. But you know, if the tests exist, then sure.
Amory, your thoughts before we move on to the guys?
Sure. I would add, and maybe this is something that people with empathy would like to embark on, of what patients would like. So you've had interaction with very high level research institutions like Stanford. You've been very fortunate in that regard, but a patient in a rural community might not have that opportunity. So it might be interesting for your organization to survey, first of all, how prevalent this problem is so that it could be an action item, and what different solutions would be. Because I think location and whether you're in a rural community or have access to a top research institution is going to make a big difference. For example, a rural institution wouldn't even be able to provide what you suggested.
I think we might have lost.
Did we lose Christine and Spandon?
I think so. They
I
look
think they-
frozen. Yeah.
So I'll keep this going. This is Eric. I'll keep
Okay.
going.
That's cool.
You know, one thing to think about here, you know, that I think is helpful for me in understanding this, and you know, I'm going to riff off something Mike said, and that's this idea of control of data. I think in some ways, yes. I mean, losing your data and losing access to your data aren't exactly the same thing. And unfortunately, if you look at between national laws like HIPAA and state laws, which actually preempt who owns data, you know, most of these states basically say the institution technically owns your data, you know, because it's in their EHR system and they're responsible for it, whatever. So I think the issue of control is important. And the reason why I think that way is because I'm both getting skeptical and also a little disappointed that we're ever really going to see comprehensive privacy legislation in this country. And I even a lot of my cybersecurity friends are kind of in the privacy is dead, or it's a unicorn you're not going to find anymore camp, which I don't buy into. But there's part of that argument that I think is real important. And the part of that argument is, does it make sense to try to understand what privacy or perfect privacy or control look like? Or is it possibly more pragmatic and important to figure out what bad looks like? So do I have to write a law that says how everybody has to protect data? Or do I need laws to say, this is what bad looks like? If you do this with patients' data, we're going to come after you for that. You know, and a lot of legal people that I talk to, and I'm not a lawyer, say the latter is actually more doable. And I think if you look at what happened with Google Brain and Facebook and some of these things in the EU, this is more the tack that the European Union took with some of these things, where even before GDPR was on the books, they had strong ideas of what bad looked like with data, severing patients from access to their data, but also uses that would not in proper intent of what the patients probably would have wanted. And I know that's compelling. I threw it out there on purpose or controversial.
No, but it's an interesting.
And I just got to say, you guys, we, Silicon Valley, we got dropped. Because I always do, but I'm back. So I missed a little bit of it, but we tuned in the end. And I want to say thank you for continuing the conversation as I dropped off. And Eric, Mike, go ahead. Now you can respond. I just want to make sure you all knew that that's what happened to us.
Well, I think it's an interesting, Eric raises an interesting point about, you know, what are the ways forward, right? And I think that's sort of one of the key points here is, you know, a lot of things have happened in the past. It's a lot of players out there, and how are you going to sort of put something together, like a comprehensive reform almost, right? You know, and I think there are, like I said, there are some patient groups kind of trying to take some of this stuff on, right? Trying to raise funds for it. You know, Christine's involved, Eric's involved, right? And in the Light Collective, and you know, I think that very much is patient communities. But, you know, I think there's a piece we're missing also. And, you know, I think we're focusing a lot on hospital systems, right? And there's a lot that we can do at hospital systems, right? From from PFACs that exist to kind of taking different controls and measures, and different organizations can get involved, right? I mean, I have a cybersecurity consulting firm and we do some of this work, but beyond that, I think there's the other side of that we're not thinking about, which Christine and I talk a lot about, which is the clinical trials side and sort of digital health side of the world, right? Where there are these other companies that are out there and other organizations that are out there, whether they're biobanks or whether they are some managed service provider. So, take a real world example. Just the other day, a large managed service provider was essentially hacked, right? And what happened is it took down part of their systems. It compromised a large swath of patient data. And in turn, then it impacted a company whose systems are used for insurance enrollment, right? And so here you go. Here's another sort of real world example of where patient data is sort of now being breached and it's impacting sort of real world processes. But it wasn't the actual company that had an issue. It was their managed service provider. It was their vendor, right? So I think as folks are involved in clinical trials, right, there are so many vendors in the mix, and what is the oversight that those sort of organizations need to have, right? Versus what does the pharma company or the CRO just kind of say, like, wash their hands of it, right? Say, well, we have a signed contract, right? But the same thing happens with hospital systems, and all these other companies that are in the mix, kind of working with your data and toying around with data. There are a lot of different places for challenges to occur, right? And I think it's hard to wrap our heads around it, particularly as patients living in the system. I mean, you have to call it that, a system, because there are so many components interacting with each other. I often lose track of who the heck may have even had my data at some point or another in my life cycle, right? Because I'm on Medicare, but I also have private insurance, and so, gosh, where do I start, right?
And that's the thing too, is a lot of people on Medicare too. I mean, I'm on Medicare myself, and I don't know. This is just a whole crazy world that we just don't know anything about. And I think, there's so many different things and different aspects to data that people don't think about. And it is scary out there. And as a person and as a patient, I don't know, Eric, what can I do? What do you think we can do as people or as industry even to make sure that these things, benefit all of us? Because I do see a lot of people that come into this space, and there's a lot of people that say, all of this patient data, patients shouldn't own their data. It's unethical for patients to do this. And I think, okay, if we're talking money and we're talking unethical, I think it's unethical for all of you to make thousands of dollars when I'm making absolutely nothing off of this. And no guarantee of getting a drug maybe, or whatever it is, right? But I'm wondering where it comes into this whole ethical decisions of money. Why am I regarded as nothing? And my data is more important than me,
Yeah, I think Mike mentions something that I think is important. For people that are really interested in this topic, if you haven't read up on things like surveillance capitalism, take this chance to make a note of yourself to read up a little bit on that. And it's really how institutions are making money off all of our data, everything from supermarket loyalty cards to your medical records and everything like that. The way I advise people, and I do this because I take having been a CIO at places like Johnson & Johnson, a pharma company, and at places like FDA, right? I'm a realist about this, right? And I think there's a couple things. I think first and foremost, one really useful kind of exemplar from the cybersecurity world is this idea of attack surface, that the more institutions you share data with, the more connections you make, the more mobile devices, the more online accounts you have, the greater your exposure is. And if you're somebody that's worried, or somebody that's worried, for example, I might lose my job if my diagnosis status gets out, or anything that can go wrong with healthcare data, something to think about is minimizing that surface, making it as small as possible. The other thing is that keep good records of your own an event of loss. You know, the interesting thing, a lot of records that have been lost in healthcare have been lost to ransomware. The truth about ransomware, though, is they can only really lock your systems if you can't recover them because you don't have everything backed up the right way, right? So it's you know it's important to think about. The other thing is that, you know, leaning into digital a little bit, there are institutions and companies, you know, the Picnic Healths of the world, that do help people aggregate and keep their electronic data. You know, it's a fee for service thing, but again, if it's something that you're a caregiver for a spouse or something and it's a big deal for you, these things might really make sense. So I do think there's a lot of things in the consumer world that are helpful with this. And I do think that you have to assume people are going to monetize and take data. They just are. I think assuming they're not, you know. And the other thing is that as a former FDA person, the history of regulation worldwide is that regulation always comes from behind. Somebody has to do something bad, then someone has to figure out that it's bad, and then somebody might do something about it. And let's be clear, this isn't just fact, this is actually a business model. I firmly believe, and I'll go on record, people can get mad at me, that the vaping industry knew the product was harmful, but they also knew that, you know, we'll get this out there and in 5 years, we'll make N billions of dollars before we're told to stop. And so they just do it. They propagate, you know, vaping stores like Blockbuster. So I do think we have to make those assumptions when you think about your data, and it does start at home. But there are groups, as you said, like the Light Collective, like even again, the McAfee's, the Norton, the stuff you can get at Staples. You know, these companies have good advice and stuff like that to educate yourselves.
So we do have a comment that's coming that we wanted to address. So I'm going to let Spandon take over.
Yeah, and this is sort of dovetails with what Eric just said. You know, this data and how people use data. There is both good and bad. Like there's also, you know, research that is using, you know, health data for good to develop a therapy maybe, or to develop, you know, a diagnostic tool. So the question is, how do we address this data in a way so that privacy concerns don't just automatically lead to us, you know, just locking up concerns and fears, just lead to us locking up our data, or to keep it from being used for good while also preventing it for being used for evil, right? So
I'd like to take a first swing at this because it's something I've written about recently, if I could.
Please
You know,
do.
just so you know, I actually don't buy the premise of the argument most of the time, but let me say why. I think that right now in this country, clinical trials are voluntary. People can't and should not be compelled to be in clinical trials, right? So I actually believe that's the nearest metaphor to taking health data directly from like systems, hospitals and stuff, and selling it to companies that are doing medical research. I don't necessarily think it needs to be consented, but I do believe it at least needs to be informed, that people should have the choice to opt out. One of the most brilliant slices of the global data protection regulations in the EU is this right to erasure, that companies have to protect your data well enough where if you say, I want out of that data set, they have to be able to do it. If you think about that, that's interesting, because if I can be removed at any time from a data set, then it means you never could truly anonymize that data set, because if you did, how could you find me? Right? So there's interesting things there, but I do know that lots of people want to use this data for good. I think it needs to be done transparently. People need to be informed, not consented, more like opt out. And I do think that it has to be done that way, because you can't compel people to be in clinical trials, and this is the nearest kind of legal metaphor.
Renee and Amory, any thoughts?
So actually, it's a good point you raise, Eric, in terms of whether how your data is erasable. And we dealt with this when we were running the Digital Me program at Patients Like Me. And if somebody had opted out of the program, we could erase all of the information that we had about them. But if we had already used their data in an anonymized way, so for all of the research that we did, identifiable information was not a requirement for it. And frankly, as a researcher, I would rather not have any access to identifiable information whatsoever. Can't even think of a time where I absolutely needed it. But in that case, if your data was already part of an analysis, there was no way that we could take it away. At that point, it was anonymized. It was part of an aggregate, but you obviously can't be continually changing your results if you're pulling data in and out. So at that point too, but I don't, that's another thing where I don't know how transparent that is, which, in our consent, we had that available. But, if I just asked my dad, for example, did he know that if he had opted into this biobank and they used it and he decided to opt out, but they had already, published 3 papers on it, his data is still going to be part of those papers no matter what, right? That I don't know if people think about a lot.
I never thought about it at all. So thank you now, Renee, for making me worry about another thing.
And just following up on that, I just wanted to also follow up something that Eric said. My understanding of clinical trials, I was at the NIH for about 10 years. I'm a PhD scientist, but I was involved with clinical trials, is that any use of data has to be approved by an internal review board, which is an independent group of physicians, researchers, and then administrators, both inside and outside the institution. Sometimes you use a third-party independent IRB, but every use of the data needs to be approved by that group. So at least in terms of clinical trials, whatever form, and Eric made the distinction between consent and use of data. I'm not really familiar with those forms, but clearly, if a researcher uses data for something that's not approved in the IRB, that's a problem. So.
And most of the uses that I come across, and I think Spandon, this might be behind the question or not, are actually secondary uses of data from places like tech companies that are not doing IRB approved studies.
Right.
Because I would agree with you that, and I've actually often said that. I've often said that sometimes, there was this thing about a year ago that Facebook did where they got a lot of bad press because they were looking at data. Had they just done an IRB approved study, I sometimes look at it and say, why not just do it the right way, right? Yeah. If it's a real important study, go get an IRB approval and consent people and do the good work. I just think that, there's one of the 4 pillars of medical ethics is autonomy. Self-determination, privacy comes from this, et cetera. And I think that's what we hit on when we assume, well, this is good work, so people should allow their data to be used for it.
And I would just follow up with that from a patient point of view and people with empathy, getting the word out, education for patients to ask questions and be participants, in trials that, as Eric said, are doing it the right way. And a lot of companies that are developing diagnostics and prognostics are doing it the right way. But of course, there are companies out there that the primary motivation is financial, and that could be very different. So I think education is an important component, because from the patient looking at these various options, it may not be apparent whether it's an IRB approved study where there's a lot of protections, or whether it's a company that it appears that the company is giving the patient something in return for their sample or their data.
So,
Mike, sorry, go ahead, Sven.
Come in here in just a second. I do want to say that part of our conversation has been retrospective, and part of it is prospective, right? Like looking forward. We want to talk about, in this last 10 minutes, a little bit about tools that should exist, maybe that doesn't, for people to track or being in charge of their data, right? Target gets your credit card lost. You get a call from Target, you get an alert from Citi, you get all of it, and then there's an actual procedure laid out as to how you can lock down your card, how you can freeze your credit reports, et cetera, which I don't think exists in the healthcare space. And so, Mike, starting with you, address that a little bit, why that doesn't happen, what we need, um, in order to have a future of data that that is like Eric said is um, where people have control, at least in information, right, about their data. At least they're informed.
I mean, I think it's an interesting point, right? And I think it kind of goes back to maybe the parallels that we discussed earlier in the conversation, which are around, the sort of the thought process around controlling our data and sort of consumer, the sort of the consumer world, right, of credit and things like that. And is there a parallel, and can a parallel be made? I think there in the future, yes, I think there could be a parallel to that, right? At the moment, I don't believe there is a parallel, because we don't have the same capabilities to do it, because we don't have the ability to authorize control, or as Eric kind of said, autonomy, right? I think with credit, you have autonomy to an extent, right? You decide to open a credit card or a debit card with this bank. It might be the only one you have, right? And so then you can stop that, right? If you decide to open 3 credit cards, it's all on you, right? And it's on you to monitor also, right? It's on the company's monitor, but things fall through the cracks occasionally. But it's on you to monitor, and then you're immediately told, almost, well, not immediately, maybe long after the fact, if your credit is breached, right? And sort of what can happen. But I think it comes down again to autonomy. So I like that Eric brought up that word, because I think that's very relevant in consumers space.
I hate to interrupt you, but we do have a question that I kind of want to address really quick from Harsha. Hi, Harsha. We all know him. So Harsha is asking to Eric and everyone, are there standard guidelines around patient data sharing, patients being custodians of their own data, especially globally across national borders? And what are the key considerations? So if Eric, since he specifically put your name in there, why don't you start, and then we'll touch on everyone, and then I think we're almost out of time. So go ahead, Eric.
Not that I know of, as far as anything really that evolved. That I think there are best practices. I think there are, again, good ideas of what bad look like, good ideas of what privacy looks like. But I don't think there's a set of standards, a set of procedures, or anything like that exists today about what it does. Mainly because right now health data is compartmentalized from other types of data. And I think that's something we haven't mentioned that is worth it, that, right now health data is treated a certain way. It has its own set of regulations. Different agencies monitor consumer data, different agencies monitor things like that. So part of it is that, but that doesn't mean it's a bad idea. It doesn't mean it isn't something that should be done. If you dig a little further, you'd actually find, at least for example, between the European Union and the US, GXP regulation, good clinical practice, good manufacturing practice, good laboratory practice regulations actually do contain a lot of very similar language, and actually have gotten to the point where regulatory agencies can audit and accept audits from other countries doing the auditing. So I do think that there are frameworks in place for a lot of that stuff, but not just to adjust the way patient is. But of course, Europe has now jumped ahead with GDPR. California has now jumped ahead in a way, right? And a big thing. So every time we get it close together, it seems like it's simultaneously unraveling. But I do think the best practices are clear. More importantly, I actually think the bad practices are even clearer. And that, starting with what we're not going to do with data isn't a bad way to approach a new initiative.
I like that thought. Mike, anything you have to say really quickly? We've got 5 minutes left.
I mean, that was a really good summary. I would say, Europe kind of, and some other countries kind of lead the way on this, right? And maybe respect privacy more. I don't know why the United States maybe and some other countries refuse to take steps maybe towards some of these things. It could be, or enforce maybe is another example, right? So there are steps, but enforcement is another one. In Europe, they do take enforcement a lot stronger. So I think that would be a next piece I would like to see is, all right, we develop things, let's enforce them, right? And if we don't enforce them, there's no point in developing these things, right? So when we think about data sharing, there are different ways to share data, but we don't mandate them. I mean, we do, but then if you don't do it, there's no enforcement. It's kind of like wearing a mask right now. So I would like
We're
to
all
see.
wearing it. Ladies, any comments from you?
I would say that really education is really important, and so that patients can understand the difference between these different entities, what are safer things to participate in than others, questions to ask, the idea that Eric talked about consent versus understanding of what people are really agreeing to. I think really, since that's the group that's affecting the most, to really provide tools, and people with empathy is poised to do that, so that people have the ability to make decisions. And that will always be the first step. Changing regulations, things at a high level, a country level, the FDA, different regulatory organizations, it can be done. But that's a much bigger thing to do. And as they say, it always starts at home. So I think education is key.
Yeah, thank you. Renee, any remarks from you?
None that haven't already been covered, I'd say.
So I want to just say, since we're wrapping up and actually on time, I do want to say thank you to all of you. Jim Murray, who's one of my board members, we had a talk this morning, and I have you guys as friends, and I have these conversations with everybody daily. And I think that it's interesting, and to share these perspectives. And I look at things as like kind of making a pencil, right? This whole collective intelligence and collective leadership, that a pencil is pretty much perfect. Not perfect, but you know, nobody has any big issues with it, but it wasn't one person that made a pencil, right? It was the person with the lead and the eraser and the little metal thing and all these things. And so I think it's bringing together these perspectives, and thank you for sharing it from each of your sides, because I think all of these go into it, and that's what's going to help us come to the best possible solutions, is these discussions that actually look and hear other perspectives. So as my friends, I want to thank you guys, because we have had a huge response to these chats, and we're going to continue on. Our next session is actually going to be on precision medicine.
Actually, our next session is going to be on expanded access.
Oh, expanded access.
Later this month, following, yeah. I do want to say there are a few people in the chat room. I know that we didn't quite get to your questions, but I will check in with our experts and get your questions answered for you. So please don't get discouraged that we didn't get there yet. And as part of People with Empathy's mission, you know, like Amory said, we are looking into how to better do this education portion of it, right? How to, you know, how to simplify things, how to make sure people understand what they're consenting to, right? I am
not an expert on anything. I started as a patient and did not want to be this far into it, but you know, I'm finding out things that I didn't know that everybody else should know. So Eric, especially you, thank you for your time and for all of your information on this, because you are one of the experts. And Mike, you know, just for listening to me all the time. And ladies, I am so happy you joined us, and I'm looking forward to seeing what we do together. And anyone out there, if you have topics that you'd like us to discuss, we're trying to pull in perspectives from different people to just kind of see solutions and see where we can go. So thank you again, all of you. I appreciate it. We are at 9:30. So I don't want to keep anyone on, but thank you again. And we'll answer your questions if you have them in the chat.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for having me. Cheers.